Good to see all of you here. Today I want to talk to you about spiritualism, the beginning. Now, many of you don't know the true story, so you're going to hear it today. In 1843 to about 1845, there was this little cottage in Hamlet, in Hydesville. And Mr. Hydesville was renting it out to various renters. And the first family that we're going to talk about today is the Bells. The Bell family, husband and wife, were living in the cottage. And they had this caregiver, well, not necessarily caregiver, but housekeeper, who did things around the house, like cooked and cleaned and those type of things, kept up with the house. And she was about 15 years old. Her name was Lucretia Pulver. And she assisted in whatever way the Bells needed her to. Well, one day, the peddler came around. Now, back in the day, you have to travel with me back in time. Remember, we're in 1843. We didn't have grocery stores and convenience stores and department stores. There would be a peddler who would come along carrying a box of things that people needed. So this is how they purchased some things. And Mrs. Bell decided she was going to purchase a thimble and some other things. Well, Lucretia happened to be there on that day, and she said, you know, I really like this piece of material. Is there any way that you could come to my father's house tomorrow, because I don't have the money here with me today? And of course the peddler agreed. And it was about that time when she went home. She was still going to school. So she went home, and Mr. or Mrs. Bell kept looking through the peddler's thing, picked out some things for herself. And he left. And then they called Lucretia and said, you know what? We don't need your services anymore. We're good. We don't need help anymore around the house. I can handle it, Mrs. Bell said to her. And she said, okay. Being perplexed of what all of a sudden happened, that she was not needed, she was concerned, but thought, all right. So she went, you know, her father said that the peddler never came back. And she's like, well, he promised me he would bring my material and then I would pay him today. So she thought, well, maybe he got held up somewhere. So another day came, never received a call from the peddler. She thought, well, that's pretty strange. I wonder what's going on. Well, a few days later, Mrs. Bell said, oh, you know, if you could come back and help us around the house, we would appreciate it. And so she was like, well, okay, sure. So she was tidying things up, and she started to hear noises in the house. And at one point in time, as she was standing in the kitchen doing the dishes, she thought that she saw a shadow of a man with sandy hair and a gray suit. She looked again, and nobody was there. So one day, Mrs. Bell said to her, could you go down into the cellar and close the windows, because we're expecting rain? So she said, of course. So she went down into the cellar and abruptly sank down to her knees in dirt. She was like, what's going on? Why am I sinking in this dirt? Well, she latched the door. She had screamed, of course, at this point, like any of us would if we sank down to our knees in dirt. So Mrs. Bell came, are you okay? Is everything all right? She's like, there's a bunch of loose dirt in the cellar. What? She's like, oh, that's just the rats. You know, I'll have my husband fix it. She said, okay. So over the next couple of days, Mr. Bell, only under the cover of darkness, was wheelbarrowing dirt into the cellar, filling that cellar up. So she said, well, we've taken care of, Mrs. Bell said, we've taken care of the rats, to Lucretia, down in the basement. We filled in the dirt and it should be better now. She's like, okay. Well, then as she was going about her normal daily business, you know, cleaning and organizing and straightening, she started to hear raps in the house. She's like, what was that? She heard another rap. She's like, what's going on? This is really strange. So Mr. Bell said, oh, it's nothing, don't worry about it. And then she heard something like somebody going down the steps to the cellar, being dragged. She thought, that's pretty strange. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Bell just kept on, never said anything. And eventually Mrs. Bell became very, very, very ill. And she ended up having to go to her sister's for a period of time. So she went to her sister's. And they asked Lucretia if she could stay in the house and watch the house while they were gone. And she said, of course I will. So one night when she was sleeping, she felt the covers being tugged on her bed. She thought, that's pretty weird. Nobody's in the house but me. So the next morning, she called her mother over and said, look, something's going on in this house, and I need you to come over and stay with me till they come back. So her mother came over, and they both experienced noises and raps in the house. Now, I know many of you watch some of the ghost things on TV, and how excited you get when you hear this, and you probably already know in your head, well, that's just their grandmother, or that's just their father, or whatever. But this is a 15-year-old girl, alone, in this house, until her mother came over. So the Bells eventually came back. Mrs. Bell continued to decline and decline and decline in health until they eventually had to move. So they actually moved in with her sister. The next couple who rented were called the Weekmans, Mr. and Mrs. Weekman, and they were in there from about 1944 to 1945. And they had a 9-year-old daughter. And she was, of course, in the other room, and she started to hear noises at night. She heard rapping. She started to get concerned, and then one night, when she was asleep, she felt a cold hand go over her face, and somebody sitting on the foot of her bed. Now, 9 years old, I don't know if any of you had kids, but that's pretty young, right? 9 years old. So they eventually left. They couldn't take the noises anymore. And the Foxes moved in. Now, the Foxes were a family of 6. They had 2 young girls still living with them, Katie and Maggie. Some called her Kathy. Some called her Margaretta. And they moved into the house, and for the first couple weeks, everything was quiet and everything was still. And then the knocks came. They started hearing the knocks. And Mr. Fox was like, what is that noise? So he went out, walked around the building, thought it's probably just a branch with the wind hitting the window. You know, we as spiritualists always teach you, research, don't just take it for granted that everything is from spirit. So they walked all the way around the house, nothing. They, by this time, were just getting so tired and so exhausted because these noises would occur at night. And usually the loudest in the girls' room. There were a couple nights that the girls actually slept in their bedroom because they were so afraid. Mr. Fox heard a knocking at the door, went to the door, opened it. There was nobody there. So he thought, I'm going to wait here until the knock comes. The knock came. He opened the door. There was nobody there. Now, Katie and Maggie were 9 and 12. So they were quite young. But they decided, no, we're going to have some fun. We're going to see if we can talk to this thing that's making all these noises. So they were sitting in bed one night. Katie said, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do. And she banged her hand 3 times, and she heard. Now, of course, this interests the girls because they were like, oh my gosh, we have something that can interact with us. So Maggie said, Mr. Splitfoot, do as I do. And again, so they called their parents in, and she's like, Mommy, it can see as well as hear. And at this time, Mrs. Fox became very curious. She thought, that's pretty interesting. So she started asking questions. Are you a human? If you're a human, give me 2 raps. Nothing came. She said, if you're a spirit, give me 2 raps. And 2 raps came. And then they started to be even more curious. She said, how many children do I have? And there were 7 raps. She's like, I don't have 7, I only have 6. What's going on? And she thought, how many living children do I have? And there were 6 knocks. Now she went along to ask some questions that nobody would know, and found out that these were pretty accurate. She started asking the spirit questions about who he was, what happened. And he said that he was murdered in the house. He was a 31-year-old father of 5, and murdered for the sum of $500. I thought, well, that's pretty terrible. She said, will you keep rapping if I invite my neighbors over? Because of course you want, if you want somebody else to hear this so you don't think, I'm going crazy. So they invited the neighbors over. And these raps continued, answering all of their questions. There was a gentleman by the name of Isaac Post, and he came over and he started to set up the alphabet as a way to find out who was there. Turns out his name was Charles B. Rosner. He was the peddler. And they were just astounded. Imagine those families that have been in that house, and spirit trying so hard to communicate with them. So of course the next summer they thought, well, somebody's been murdered in the house, we need to find these remains. So they started digging and digging and digging in the cellar. Remember, Rooster? Didn't find anything. Well, they found like a little piece of skull and some quicklime and some charcoal, and they thought, that's pretty weird. Well, of course the water level at that point in time was raising, so they had to stop. Had to stop the dig. But in July of 1904, they were able to excavate more of the walls. And it turned out to be the skeleton of the peddler and his peddler box. Sad. But in the same aspect, it's a little exciting, isn't it? To know that Spirit is with us and will continue to be with us. Because that's our connection. See, we're in this physical body, we've got this little coat we call a body, and we shed that, and we become pure spirit. That connection between you and spirit is always there, because that's who you first are. Each and every single person in here is a medium. You have that ability to touch in with the spirit world anytime you want. What a blessing that connection is. We don't just think that life goes on. We don't just hope that life goes on. We know through the demonstration of mediumship that life continues. And because of that family, people continue to study and develop mediumship. So when I talk about spiritualism in the beginning, that's how it started off. And just as it is in this world, it's important to know our history. It's important to know that these spirits came to two little girls. Why little girls? Because of their innocence and their ability to accept and continue that communication. Sometimes we hear that it's so much easier for children because they don't have all the layers and layers of disbelief that we have. Many of us have been told, don't do that. People will think you're crazy. How many of you had imaginary friends? We know, as spiritualists, that we do continue. And we know that that communication between this and the spirit world is so very precious. When we lose loved ones, they're not far. That connection with them is still present. They are still here to provide us comfort and support us on our journey. Some of you know that my mother recently passed to spirit February last month. And I'm a spiritualist. I've been a spiritualist for many years. And I said to her before she left, I said, you come back and talk to me. Does that mean that I didn't go through the grief process? Absolutely not. To be honest with you, I was pretty much a basket case. My mother and I were very, very close. And for the last 18 months of her life, I was able to have her in my home. I was able to be nurturing and caring for her. And every night I went to bed, I'd say, please let me have no regrets. Allow me to enhance that connection from the spirit world. There was a time I went into her room and she's like, I'm afraid. And I said, Mom, you're afraid of what? She said, there's a man standing over there. And I said, is it Daddy? She said, no. And I couldn't figure out who it was. Now remembering I'm in my time of grief, so I'm not real clear. Because she had made the decision, she didn't want to go on, and I said, whatever you want. It's up to you, it's your choice. I respect your wishes. So I went to bed that night, and I was talking to Spirit, and I said, look, whoever that is, it's scaring my mom. So you need to tell me who you are and what you want, or don't come back. All of a sudden, in that, she came right into my head. It was a gentleman called Dr. Burgess. He was a physician here on this earth plane. And one of my dear close friends works and trance with healing for him, with him. And I said to my mom, is that the same man that you saw when you were in the hospital in March? She said yes, because in March, she turned to my friend and said, who's that man standing with you? Well, that's pretty interesting. So the next morning I got up and I said, Mom, that's Dr. Burgess. He's helping you with your healing in whatever form that may take. And as difficult as it was for me to understand, he was there to help her while she was partially in the physical and partially in the spirit world. After that, she felt comforted. Hospice was in seeing her, and they cleaned her all up. She had a bath, had her hair done. And she looked at me and she said, thank you for taking such good care of me. And the next morning she passed to spirit. She had removed her oxygen, which she never took off her face. So I knew that spirit was there to welcome her. And the first thing I said was, Daddy, you need to be there to greet her. And the vision that I saw of my father standing there with his arms open and my mother going into those arms was priceless. Because I knew at that moment that spirit was there. And they had her. And my dad had her. Your connection with people on this earth doesn't end when they pass to the world of spirit. They don't forget you. They are with you. Always. But you have to ask, because they're not going to live your life for you. And how comforted I was in the knowledge that I can still talk to my mom. And she can still talk to me. And yes, I hear from her every day. In closing, I'd like to read a poem for you. This is the song that Spiritualism sings. This is the message that Spiritualism brings. This is the message that through it came late, came to the world in 1848. Listen. You can hear them sing. There is no death. There are no dead. We live and love you still. God bless you all.